This week we have a story about a dispute between two states that lasted over 100 years and almost sparked a war between two cities, one from each of those states. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilly along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Now be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button if you've not done so already, and then give us a thumbs up if you don't mind, okay?
Steve, when we talk about this, I picture a very nice little picturesque town divided down the middle of the road, and it's just peaceful. A little busy at times, but peaceful. But it wasn't like this, though, say, 100 and so years ago when all this stuff almost sparked this war.
That's true, and I'm going to go ahead and say it's Bristol. Everybody knows it's Bristol, and we're talking about State Street.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this was, it was a very odd little war over public utilities. Let's just plain say that. How about that, Rod?
I think that's the best way to probably explain it to the viewers and the listeners out there, because this is something that kind of makes you scratch your head and you kind of wonder, why did this even start in the first place? And I guess there were a lot of egos, on the line with this, and there was a lot of bragging rights on the line with this. So we might as well just jump into this and tell everybody what's going on, shouldn't we?
We'll do that. And speaking of starting, let's really go back and start at the beginning, back in colonial times, where there was a dispute over the exact location of the border between Virginia and North Carolina and what later became Tennessee. Well, actually, though, the dispute wasn't over where the boundary should be. That was set at 36 degrees 30 minutes north pursuant to royal decree in the Royal Charter to Carolina in 1665. The problem was figuring out where 36 degrees 30 minutes was on the ground. In 1728, a survey was begun, eventually reaching to the foothills of Appalachia, about 235 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. And that survey, while accepted, nearly caused a fist fight between the surveyors, named by Virginia, and the ones named by North Carolina.
Well, in 1749, a new survey was done to extend the line west. In order to establish the boundary through the new settlements in the west, Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson, the father of Thomas Jefferson, were named by Virginia, and William Churton and Daniel Weldon were named by North Carolina. Now, their line ran from 1728, the stopping point, to a place called Steep Rock Creek, southeast of present-day Damascus, Virginia. That point is lost forever, which resulted in the continuing conflict between Virginia and Tennessee. So in 1779, with further westward settlement, North Carolina and Virginia set up a third survey, led by Colonel Thomas Walker for Virginia and Colonel Richard Henderson of North Carolina. Immediately, the two parties disagreed on where Steep Rock Creek was. Henderson favored a course that was farther to the north, and Walker favored one farther to the south. The two teams split up, each surveying a line parallel to the other and 2 miles apart, and running through the Holston River watershed to the Cumberland Gap, resulting in a 2-mile wide no man's land, where it was unclear which state controlled it.
Then, in 1802, Tennessee and Virginia agreed to yet another survey to establish a compromise line right between the Walker and Henderson lines from White Top Mountain to Cumberland Gap. Now, if you look on a map, you'll see that at Cumberland Gap, the Tennessee border jogs to the southwest and then continues west. That Tennessee-Kentucky line is the Walker line. Now, that still didn't solve all the questions surrounding the border between the two states, so in 1893, Virginia sued Tennessee in the Supreme Court, with the court ruling that the 1802 line would be the boundary between the two states, and ordered that that line be, surveyed once again. In 1903, the Supreme Court accepted that survey, in which the new surveyors failed to locate the 1802 line east of Bristol in Denton Valley. They did find markings about a mile north of the compromise line, which was the Henderson line, and the court ruled that the intent of the parties in 1802 was to use the Henderson line up to Denton Valley then moved south, and this was the true border between the states. And that took care of that, with the exception of one more change in the border. And Rod, tell him that story.
Okay. In April of 1889, Samuel L. King was the president and principal owner of the Bristol Goodson Water Company located in Bristol, Tennessee. Now, Mr. King had established his waterworks to provide water to businesses and homes across the Tennessee side and wanted to extend his pipes across Main Street to businesses located there. Now, you see, at the time, the border between Tennessee and Virginia was on the north side of Main Street, and King felt it was in his right to run water to businesses there as well, and in this particular case, Everett's Restaurant. Now, Mr. King ordered his men to begin digging a ditch across Main Street in which to lay the new pipe. As soon as the men reached the middle of the main street, they were arrested by Virginia authorities and fined for trespassing. Sam King then stepped into the ditch himself in a show of defiance, and he, too, was arrested by Officer James Cox and taken to the Goodson jail. Now, the town council of Goodson issued an injunction restraining the Bristol Goodson Water Company from working beyond the middle of Main Street. Well, that should have been that, shouldn't it, Steve?
Guess what? It wasn't.
It wasn't. Okay.
As soon as the King Company was made to stop its work, the Goodson Town Council ordered that a water pipe of their own was to be laid right down in the middle of Main Street, infuriating King. Sam King called on Governor Taylor of Tennessee from the neighboring town of Elizabethton for help, arguing that there was no agreement as to the exact location of the state line between the two cities, just that it fell along the north side of Main Street. In response, Governor Taylor referred him to court. Soon, Tennessee Chancellor John P. Smith issued his own injunction, restraining Goodson from continuing their pipeline down Main Street. Sullivan County Sheriff Cartwright and his deputies, along with a posse comitatus that the good sheriff had rounded up, arrived on the scene from the Tennessee side, where they met Washington County, Virginia Sheriff Hughes and his deputies across the street in Goodson. The Tennessee posse consisted of several hundred men, many of whom needed to be armed. No problem there, as Sam King led the men to seize the armory of the ADR rifles and took their guns for use against those unreasonable Virginians. Cartwright's forces, along with King, lined up and down Main Street facing the ditch that the Goodson Council had ordered dug, and the Washington County Sheriff's forces were on the other side of the street.
Okay, here was the situation at that time. The workers in the ditch were armed. The Sullivan County Sheriff and his deputies, including Sam King, who was deputized for this action, were all armed. The several hundred men in the posse were armed, many with brand new rifles and sidearms. The Washington County Sheriff and his deputies were armed. This was a tinderbox about to go off, and then it happened. Sullivan County Sheriff Cartwright had a warrant for Washington County Deputy James Cox, who, if you will remember, was the officer who arrested Sam King. Now, Cartwright stepped over the ditch in the middle of Main Street to serve Cox. Cox turned to leave in order to avoid service and accidentally caught his foot in one of the new water pipes being laid in the ditch. And he fell into the ditch, followed immediately by Sheriff Cartwright, who landed on top of him. Goodson police officer Charles Worley came to the aid of Cox, and the chief of police of Bristol and his deputy rescued Cartwright.
At this point, common sense appeared to return, with Goodson Mayor Seneca withdrawing the workers from the ditch and away from the state line. Everybody cooled off and backed away while the boundary dispute worked its way through the Supreme Court. And as a result, the final adjustment in the state line between Virginia and Tennessee occurred on January 28, 1903, when Tennessee ceded to Virginia the northern half of Main Street, now named State Street, establishing the border where it is today, right down the middle of that street.
Wow,
there
Steve.
You go, Rod. How about that?
You know, it almost erases all of those visions of right down the middle of the street, Tennessee, Virginia, the beautiful trees on both sides of State Street as you go down the street and so forth. All that almost got erased, or at least in my memory, at least, by this little situation that happened between all the law enforcement agencies and the people responsible. So, wow. I did not know this about Bristol, Tennessee and Bristol, Virginia, and all the stuff that was going on with it.
Well, it's a pretty big story locally, although I don't know how much people nowadays over in Bristol have heard this story about a civil war over a water pipe, basically. But it's an interesting story, and I guess it just goes to show, some of the odd things that happen around here, particularly when you're trying to figure out the boundary line, which should have been simple. Run it straight down that line along that parallel, but they didn't do that, not one bit.
Somebody just did not want an advantage or a disadvantage, however way you want to look at it.
Yeah, that's true. And folks, that's the story of the boundary dispute between Tennessee and Virginia that resulted in the Bristol Waterworks War, another part of the history of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, Stitcher, Google Play, Odyssey, Good Pods, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always, you can subscribe here on YouTube by going down below and clicking that subscribe button, and we'd love it if you did that. Again, thanks for listening, folks. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.